Hey, in this lesson, we're going to look briefly at the flow of sound through an effect, or what's known as the signal path. Without getting too technical, but just so you can start to get an understanding for things like serial and parallel processing, or more importantly, what an insert effect is, and how to competently use the dry-wet balance control on an effect. Now, there are two main kinds of effects that you'll hear mentioned when producing, at least when mixing, and that's insert effects and send effects. Now, these different categorizations don't refer to what the effects are doing to the signal path specifically, which we'll be moving on to in the next module as we explore the multitude of different audio effect types, but actually refer to where an effect is located in a signal path, which basically means whether the effect is applying processing directly to a signal or on a separate signal path which is being layered on top. To try and avoid any confusion here, I'll demonstrate this in diagrammatic form. So here's our insert effect then. In this case, it's an EQ, as you can see by the frequencies on the analyzer and the curve here. And it's been inserted directly onto the signal path, indicated by the red line here, that's on a particular track on the mixer. So in other words, in your DAW, you've just dropped an EQ straight onto the track, and then the sound on that track is passing directly into the EQ, where it's then being modified in some way. In this case, it's having its frequencies adjusted in whatever way you like here. And then what comes out of the effect is the processed sound that has been shaped by the EQ. And now insert effect 2. Sorry about the zigzagging, but just fitted on the screen a bit better. So once again, we have an insert effect that's been placed directly on the signal path on a track, which means once again, the sound on the track is going directly into the effect. But this time, because the effect has a dry-wet control, in this case it's a delay, but it could be one of a number of effects, the difference here is that the signal path is splitting in two within the effect. So that one signal path through the effect is the non-processed sound, where the effect is literally doing nothing to the signal. So it's passing straight through the effect as if it wasn't there. And this is the dry sound. And this separate signal path is the processed sound. So it's the one that's being modified by our effect. In this case, it's a delay, so it's being delayed. And then what happens at the output is we get these two signals combining and blending in some way so that we end up with the sound with some processing, where the amount of processing is determined by the dry-wet amount. And this actually means that it might have no processing if the dial is set all the way in one direction to the dry end, or it might have just processing if it's set all the way to the wet end. So just to demonstrate this a bit more clearly, here's that sound splitting into two signal paths within the delay. And we can see the dry-wet control, this time represented by a crossfader, which you'll be familiar with if you've done any DJing. So on one end of the crossfader, we have the dry signal, which is the non-processed sound, don't forget, the one that's not being touched by the effect in any way. And on the other end of the crossfader, we have the wet sound, which is the processed, or in this case, delayed sound. And as you move the crossfader in one or the other direction, it will fade out the signal on the other end. So that when we move all the way to the dry position, the wet sound gets faded out. So we're just left with dry, and then going the other way, it works in the opposite direction. And then in the middle, we can have a blend of both of these signals. Just to make that ultra clear then, I'll add an animation. So you can see when the crossfader moves over to the dry end, we get the processed sound fading out. So we're just left with the non-processed. And then when it goes the other way, you can see the non-processed fades out and the processed fades in. So we're just left with the delayed sound now. And then in the middle, you can see we get a 50-50 split of non-processed and processed. And finally, an example of a send effect. So here we have our slightly more advanced setup. And we're actually not going to cover send effects on this course, but I just wanted to introduce the idea of them at this stage so you know the difference. And you can see at the top here we have our insert effect, just like before, insert effect 1. So we have our mixer track with the sound on that mixer track going straight into our EQ. And then what's coming out of the effect is the EQ'd sound still on this mixer track. But in addition to this, what's known as serial processing, we have some parallel processing being applied separately. And the way this is done is by sending the signal on the mixer track to an entirely different track on the mixer. And in some DAWs, this is known as an auxiliary track. In Ableton Live, it's known as a return track. And on that return track, we can add any effects we like. So on this one, we have a delay. But the difference here is that on this track, we have the delay set 100% wet because we're not interested in the non-processed sound anymore. We just want to hear the processed sound, so just the delayed sound. But the advantage to doing it this way is you end up with two completely separate signal paths or mixer tracks that can then be combined together and mixed in whatever ways you like, because they have their own completely independent level controls, in this case, faders on the mixer. So this is an example of parallel processing, one of the most common ones that you see in production, with a send effect on an auxiliary or a return track. So now you know essentially what an insert effect is. Basically a sound-altering device that's placed directly on the signal path of a sound, normally on its mixer track, for instance, and is therefore applying what's known as serial processing to that sound, as opposed to the parallel processing that send effects apply.